A common notion concerning prehistoric people has circulated so extensively that it evolved into general understanding without proper examination of its validity. The notion claims that hunter-gatherer forebears of ours existed in an unending severe loop of plenty and shortage, filling up on mammoth meat after a good hunt, and subsequently enduring hunger for many weeks until another fortunate kill occurred. This concept sits so firmly in contemporary thought that it formed the basis for a complete scientific explanation aimed at accounting for why numerous individuals currently deal with excess weight and diabetes. The concept posits that human physiology remains prepared for a food shortage, which, for the majority of people in today's society, will never materialize. An unexpected development arose when investigators eventually examined whether hunter-gatherers faced more regular or harsher famines compared to other society types. The findings revealed something truly unexpected. They did not. In fact, hunter-gatherers seem to have faced famine less frequently and with less intensity than the agriculturalists who followed them and took up what most regard as a superior lifestyle. The familiar depiction of the hungry prehistoric person, always close to death, from one failed hunt, thin and urgent between successful ones, proves to be much more legend than reality. The actual account of how prehistoric people dealt with lack of food combines intelligent community organization, unexpected variety in eating habits, underappreciated ability to use leftovers from animals, and a physiology that was never as urgently needing that large animal as people have long believed. Begin by taking apart the false belief, because grasping precisely the reasons for its incorrectness reveals nearly all necessary information about the practical methods ancient people used to deal with limited food supplies. An important investigation that examined an extensive database of recorded hunter-gatherer groups from various cultures, aimed particularly at checking the premise incorporated into many years of general science literature and educational drawings. The premise stated that foraging groups exist always near the brink of hunger, one unsuccessful hunt distant from catastrophe. The actual discoveries by the investigators completely opposed that common and seldom challenged premise. Hunter-gatherer communities went through periods of reduced food that were usually seasonal or connected to particular local interruptions in resources. These were temporary reductions that any group might handle, yet famines lasting multiple years that led to notable deaths were truly rare among the groups examined. Significant local lacks might happen every several decades in a certain setting, frequently after extended dry periods or another interruption to an important resource, such as a fish migration or a specific plant crop. But community systems in these groups typically stop those lacks from growing into the mass hunger incidents that appear so often in written history. In contrast with initial farming groups, where the situation appears much more severe and much more vulnerable. Failures of crops that could start real famine might happen in basically any dry year without advance notice. And repeated multi-year food crises became usual in numerous areas, especially where agriculture first grew stronger, and where methods of storing and rising social differences both grew at the same time. This focused danger in manners that hunter-gatherer existence simply avoided. The records from plant remains and history support this plainly and steadily. Regular crop failures, increases in grain costs, and thoroughly recorded famines show up repeatedly throughout farming societies, starting from the Neolithic period. Meanwhile, records of large famines for hunter-gatherer groups stay relatively scarce over the same wide period of known and deduced history. The brief summary is nearly the complete reverse of what most individuals naturally believe. Hunter-gatherer communities faced fewer, briefer, and milder famines than the initial farming groups that ultimately took their place in most regions of the planet. Therefore, what causes the ongoing hunger legend to remain so firmly, even though the evidence indicates strongly the opposite direction? In part because establishing permanent homes and growing crops appears at first glance like clear, step-by-step advancement, which renders it truly hard to picture that the way of life replaced by agriculture might have been more secure regarding food in significant measurable aspects. And in part because the thrifty gene idea, the scientific explanation constructed straight from the premise of regular ancestral cycles of plenty and shortage, grew so powerful in medical and evolutionary studies during the 1900s that its basic assumptions seldom received serious thorough challenge for long periods. We will return to that idea soon, because its history represents truly one of the more notable scientific adjustments in recent times, and it connects all elements in this discussion by the conclusion. Thus, if hunter-gatherers were not always hungry in the manner that common views demand, What methods did they employ to stop limited food from becoming a real, deadly emergency? The response involves a notably advanced set of tools constructed not around one outstanding answer, but around multiple concurrent approaches operating jointly, with each compensating for the shortcomings of the others. The initial and likely primary approach involved variety in diet. Hunter-gatherer groups depended on what specialists term broad-spectrum foraging, obtaining food at the same time from animal flesh, aquatic creatures, tree seeds, underground roots, plant fruits, water-shell animals, and uncultivated cereals according to what the nearby surroundings provided during the shifting periods of the year. This held great significance because it ensured that a hunter-gatherer community's continued existence never relied on any one food item succeeding on a particular day. If the pursuit of large animals did not succeed for an entire week, there remained roots to extract from soil, tree seeds to collect from adjacent plants, and shell animals to gather beside a suitable water edge. Contrast this intentionally varied method with initial farming groups which progressively focused their complete energy intake on only one or two main crops, such as wheat, barley, rice, or maize, based on the particular area and weather. That limited focus produced great productivity and notable energy production when growth circumstances were favorable, yet it also produced great fragile vulnerability when circumstances eventually became unfavorable. Because one crop failure could eliminate the vast majority of a whole community's food provisions in merely one poor growth period. Hunter-gatherers, by distributing their eating risk over many truly distinct food items simultaneously, had essentially established a form of inherent protection against any one resource failing without anyone intentionally creating it in that manner. The next primary approach consisted of movement itself, a liberty that farming groups intentionally surrendered the instant they dedicated themselves to prepared ground. Since hunter-gatherers did not rely on grown land fixed forever to a single spot, they could just relocate when nearby circumstances worsened, pursuing resources as they naturally moved over the nearby terrain, or shifting completely from a region facing reduction or dry conditions. This demanded entry to notably extensive areas, with calculations indicating hunter-gatherer communities usually required entry to between 7 and 500 square miles of territory, based on the abundance and consistency of the nearby surroundings, which appears like a huge quantity of area until one understands that possessing that much space to travel was exactly what allowed them to avoid local food emergencies. That would have ruined a population fixed forever to one living place. Farmers, by their nature, abandoned this possibility the instant they put significant effort into prepared groundwater systems, storage buildings, and fixed homes that could not just be taken up and moved to another place. When the earth stopped producing or the precipitation failed to arrive as expected, a farmer could not simply gather their complete means of living and travel to another location the way a forager could in a matter of days. Yet maybe the one most intelligent approach developed by prehistoric people did not concern obtaining food items in any way. It concerned community organization, particularly the intentional, culture-based manner in which food was allocated throughout the community after it was obtained by whoever succeeded on that day. Specialists examining networks of food distribution in recorded hunter-gatherer groups have discovered something truly refined in the way these communities arrange the allocation of limited provisions among their people. Instead of each person or each family managing completely alone in separation, successful pursuers usually distributed their catches extensively over the larger community, establishing a linked, continuous network of duty and mutual exchange that operated as a type of living protection arrangement extended over the whole group. If a person had a successful pursuit today, and distributed liberally to all nearby, that person could fairly anticipate others to distribute during their own later reduced periods, when their personal fortune necessarily declined for some time. A thorough numerical examination of these distribution networks discovered that the particular arrangement, reducing the danger of both personal and community hunger, tends to form itself around closely united groups, constructed particularly around the pursuers who are currently adding new food into the larger arrangement at any moment, with distribution moving outward from successful pursuers first to their close relatives, and then more extensively over the larger community in successive expected stages of allocation. This distribution arrangement meant that pursuit success did not require consistency for any one personal pursuer in order for the community as a whole to continue adequately through any particular period of time. As long as somebody in the group succeeded on any particular day or week, the resulting food was allocated extensively enough that no one encountered an immediate personal emergency, evening out the natural, inevitable lack of predictability of any personal pursuit over the whole community, rather than allowing that lack of predictability to affect completely whichever particular family happened to return, without success on that specific day. This represents, in a truly actual and measurable way, an early but truly useful type of danger, sharing the identical basic numerical concept underlying current protection markets and mutual support groups, except constructed straight into the community structure of small ancestral groups through strongly maintained standards of mutual exchange and shared duty, rather than through any official written agreement or current money organization. There exists also a continuation method that specialists have only lately begun to completely value and consider seriously, and it concerns something that appears much less impressive than exciting large animal pursuit, but might have been more significant to ongoing daily continuation than the throwing spear actions that control common views using remains of animals. For many years, using remains was regarded lightly in general science literature, as an early, somewhat awkward stage that initial humans supposedly left behind the moment they created superior, more respectable pursuit abilities. Basically the developmental counterpart of consuming unheated remaining food before humanity eventually learned to prepare a suitable meal for itself. But more current, more thorough investigation has completely reversed that superior-looking premise. An investigation directed by specialists at the National Research Center on Human Evolution discovered that using animal remains was not some urgent, embarrassing final option our predecessors were silently ashamed of and left as soon as they could. It was an intelligent, intentional, truly dependable continuation approach that demanded much less energy use than actively pursuing live escaping animals while still supplying truly energy-rich, nutrient-full food. And during times of actual environmental limitation, dead animal flesh may have been one of the single most consistent food items available to initial humans. Overall, more consistent in numerous aspects than the uncertain result of any personal pursuit. What enabled humans particularly to successfully use scavenged food, when most other creatures simply cannot safely consume remains that have been left open for any significant duration, was a particular mix of physical and tool-based benefits operating jointly in harmony. Powerful digestive fluid permitted initial humans to process flesh that had already begun breaking down, somewhat destroying many of the harmful disease agents that would make other kinds ill when attempting the identical food without that same defense. Ability to walk long distances meant humans could travel huge expanses of land, looking carefully for remains that other meat eaters had already killed and left frequently reaching, while considerable usable flesh and fat still stayed before rival scavengers could completely remove the catch down to empty skeleton. And importantly, the mix of controlled flame rock implements and basic joint group actions meant humans could prepare and completely heat scavenged flesh in manners that further canceled whatever germ danger still stayed, while at the same time obtaining truly useful energy-dense materials like fat and skeleton center that other scavengers without implements simply could not reach, no matter how greatly. They required the energy. Specialists examining this process now characterize scavenging as having functioned smoothly together with pursuing and plant collecting as part of one adaptable, completely combined food approach, rather than existing as some distinct, lesser secondary plan kept only for the most urgent crises imaginable. When a pursuit failed completely, or when plant foods happened to be limited that particular period, scavenging was simply one more dependable, well-known option available in the set, not an embarrassing final choice that prehistoric humans attempted urgently to prevent whenever they could. Now consider what occurs within the human physiology itself when food actually becomes insufficient, despite all of these careful community and eating protections. Because this is the point where the account takes a truly interesting physical direction, and where that common thrifty gene idea mentioned previously returns into view. When the human physiology lacks food for a prolonged duration, it does not simply lose strength and stop in a simple, straight, expected manner. It progresses instead through a notably organized, multi-phase series of adjustments, particularly created by development to prolong continuation for as long as physically feasible under the conditions. In the initial 24 to 48 hours, without any food consumption, the physiology uses steadily its easily accessible glycogen reserves held in the liver and muscles, while at the same time raising gluconeogenesis, the active creation of new glucose from amino acids and glycerol, particularly to maintain blood sugar amounts at a livable level for brain operation. After this first period ends, something much more advanced begins automatically. The physiology changes firmly toward ketogenesis, altering the brain's main energy source away from glucose and toward ketone substances obtained straight from stored body fat. A basic metabolic change that greatly decreases the speed at which the physiology needs to destroy its own valuable muscle protein for emergency energy. Overall metabolic speed itself decreases noticeably as part of this larger change, controlled partly through intentional alterations in thyroid hormone function, saving valuable energy and extending available fat reserves much further than a basic, simple computation of energy in versus energy out would ever suggest on paper. After approximately 4 to 5 days of complete food lack, the physiology enters a relatively steady, nearly maintainable metabolic condition using mainly fat and ketones at intentionally automatically decreased metabolic speed. A condition that can maintain a person depending greatly on their personal initial body makeup for a bit more than a month in someone who began thin, or possibly more than a complete year in someone holding large fat reserves before complete permanent starvation finally causes death. This is exactly the refined physical system that initially motivated the thrifty gene idea, first suggested in the 1960s, which proposed that particular genes encouraging unusually effective fat accumulation during periods of abundance would have provided a major, measurable continuation benefit to ancestral humans who supposedly encountered regular, uncertain famine throughout their developmental past. And that those identical genes, now functioning mostly without check in a completely modern environment of constant, easy food plenty, are mostly accountable for current widespread excess weight and diabetes outbreaks spreading over industrial countries. It is a refined, deeply natural idea that fits smoothly into a simple developmental story, and for several decades it truly controlled standard thinking about the developmental origins of modern metabolic illness. But this is the point where the account returns straight to the beginning of this whole discussion, because that research on famine frequency covered previously straight weakens the idea's most fundamental basic premise. If hunter-gatherers truly were not facing the type of regular, harsh, population-reducing famines that the thrifty gene idea clearly needs in order for thrifty genes to actually increase meaningfully through natural selection over time, then the complete base of the idea becomes much less firm and more doubtful than its extensive popularity would otherwise indicate to most individuals. Specialists, including Jonathan Speakman, have suggested convincing different accounts instead, proposing that rather than direct active natural selection, particularly for effective fat accumulation, the related genes may simply have moved randomly through the larger human population once an earlier, more forceful developmental force, namely danger from predators for individuals who happen to be too heavy. To run from or avoid predators effectively was mostly eliminated approximately 2 million years ago, thanks to the appearance of controlled flame handheld implements and organized joint community protection against large meat eaters. Without predators actively removing the heaviest, slowest individuals from the population, generation after generation, genetic differences in overall body fat amount was simply released to move in manners it previously structurally could not, with no famine-driven selective force required at all to completely account for the pattern of body weight differences we actually see across human populations currently. This continues as a truly ongoing, unsettled, and sometimes disputed scientific discussion within developmental medicine. But it serves as a notable illustration of how a complete, influential area of excess weight investigation was confidently constructed for decades, on top of a basic premise about prehistoric hunger, that once specialists finally managed to actually examine it straight and thoroughly against real multicultural data, proved to be much less strong and less firm than nearly anyone examining the subject had expected it would be. Therefore, how did prehistoric people actually manage hunger when it did necessarily appear despite their greatest attempts? Not, it proves, through constant tense continuation, lived always on the brink of hunger, urgently waiting for the next fortunate kill, the way common views have always imagined it occurring. They managed it through notable intentional variety in diet, obtaining from many truly distinct food items at the same time, so that no single failure of any one resource could ever endanger the continuation of the entire community at once. They managed it through movement, simply traveling away from developing difficulty rather than being compelled to suffer it without help in one fixed spot. The difficult exchange settled farmers ultimately had to agree to once they dedicated themselves to prepared ground. They managed it through careful community organization, intentionally establishing food distribution networks that silently shared danger over an entire linked community long before anyone had ever created the official idea of protection or written a single agreement. They managed it through using remains, a truly intelligent, undervalued, and historically less valued approach, rather than some embarrassing final choice kept for the truly urgent. And when real limitation did finally appear, despite all of that careful readiness and community structure, their own physiologies managed the remaining difference through a refined, carefully ordered, multi-phase metabolic reduction process, particularly constructed by millions of years of development to extend continuation for as long as physically, bodily feasible. The true unexpected element hidden in all of this is not simply that prehistoric people discovered intelligent, inventive methods to continue through hunger when it eventually hit. It is that they may have actually been much more effective at preventing it initially through organization, variety, and joint effort than the farmers, and possibly even some current populations who followed them and believed they understood it more effectively. The hungry prehistoric person, it proves, was never quite as lacking in food as we have all spent many years believing he